What if the wrong address wasn't an accident, but the beginning of the most important choice of her life? The sun burned hot over the Colorado prairie that August afternoon in 1887. The land shimmered under the heat. The stagecoach rattled along the dirt road, and inside sat Margaret Rose O'Sullivan with her hands tightly gripping a worn leather satchel. Her heart beat fast with fear and hope. For 3 long weeks she had traveled from Boston, holding on to the promise of a new beginning. Her wedding dress, wrapped carefully in brown paper, rested across her knees like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. The driver shouted, "Pine Ridge Ranch." "Next stop." His rough voice cut through the shaking of the wheels. Margaret looked out the dusty window. Golden fields stretched far as the eye could see. Sagebrush danced in the hot wind. This land felt wild and alive in a way she had never felt back east. She pulled in a shaky breath. She was almost at the ranch where Thomas Whitmore, the cattle rancher she had agreed to marry, was waiting. Their letters had been few and formal. She needed an escape from her stepmother and the crushing debts left after her father died. He needed a wife to keep his ranch in order. Simple, practical, no romance needed. The coach jerked to a stop so hard that her hat fell to the floor. Margaret steadied herself and looked out. A wide porch stretched across a large log cabin. A corral reached toward the horizon. Cattle dotted the hills like ink spots on paper. "This is it, miss," the driver called, already yanking her trunk down. Margaret stepped into the blazing sun. The smell of hay and leather filled her nose. The air felt different here, lighter and wilder. She smoothed her traveling dress and gathered her courage. Each step toward the porch made her heart beat harder. Before she could knock, the door swung open. A man stood there, not Thomas. He looked to be around 30, with sun-darkened skin and storm-colored eyes. His dark hair curled slightly at the ends. His sleeves were rolled up over strong arms, scarred from hard work. He wore no fine jacket, only a simple shirt and suspenders. And in his arms was a crying baby. Margaret froze. I think there's been a mistake." The man's eyes widened as he took in her dress, her trunk, the stagecoach waiting behind her. Then he nodded slowly. "You're looking for Thomas Whitmore," he said, his deep voice calm even with the wailing baby. "Yes, I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. We wrote about marriage." Saying the word made her cheeks burn. The baby whimpered again, and the man shifted her gently with practiced ease. "Thomas lives 2 miles east," he explained. "This here is Double Creek Ranch. I'm James Morrison." Margaret swallowed hard. The driver must have taken her to the wrong place. But the man had already climbed back onto his seat, eager to keep moving. "You coming, miss? Or staying put?" he called. Margaret looked at him, then back at James. Something in James's calm face and steady eyes made her feel strangely safe. The baby's small hand clung to his shirt. Margaret's feet didn't move. "I should go," she said quietly, though her heart whispered something else. James nodded and reached for her trunk. "I'll help you carry this back to the coach." Quote. Before he could lift it, Margaret heard herself ask, "Is she yours?" James stilled. "My sister's baby," he said. "Sarah died last winter. Her husband left for California the next morning. Emma's been with me ever since." His voice carried real grief. Margaret's heart tightened. She watched how carefully he held the child, how his voice softened when he spoke of her. This was a man who carried burdens without complaint. "That's very kind of you," she whispered. "She's family," he said, as if that explained everything. The driver cleared his throat again. "Miss, I can't wait all day." Margaret took a step toward the coach, then stopped. She turned. James was watching her with those storm-colored eyes, holding the now-sleeping baby close. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, what if I don't go?" Quote. The question felt dangerous, like stepping off a cliff without knowing what lay below. James's face grew still. "That wouldn't be right. Thomas is a good man. You made an agreement. But what if the agreement was with the wrong man?" Quote. The words slipped out before she could swallow them. The driver shouted again, "Miss, last chance!" Margaret looked at the coach, then at the quiet baby, then at James. Her heart made the choice before her head could protest. "I'm staying." The coach rattled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Margaret on the porch of a stranger's home. The air felt heavy and quiet. James looked at her with a mix of shock and worry. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said slowly, "I don't think you understand what you've just done." "I do," she said, though her hands trembled. "I've made the most impulsive decision of my life. And I don't know what happens next." A slow, warm smile spread across James's face. "Then we'll figure it out together. But first, Emma needs feeding, and you look like you need supper and a place to sit down." He stepped aside, opening the door. "Welcome to Double Creek Ranch, Margaret O'Sullivan." As she walked past him into the cabin, she felt something shift in her chest. The cabin was simple, warm, full of hand-sewn quilts and wooden furniture shaped by loving hands. She felt safe here in a way she could not explain. James cared for the baby with steady hands. Margaret watched him, feeling her heart soften in a way she hadn't expected. But before she could settle, before she could understand what she was feeling, a hard knock echoed through the cabin. James looked out the window. 3 riders approached. "That'll be Thomas," he said grimly. And Margaret's breath stopped. The knocking grew louder, shaking the wooden door. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. The quiet safety she felt minutes ago vanished, like smoke. James held Emma close and stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "you don't have to do anything you don't want to do." His steady voice gave her enough courage to nod. "Let him in." James opened the door. Thomas Whitmore stepped inside, towering and sharp-eyed. He wore a clean coat, polished boots, and an expression that told Margaret he was a man who expected the world to move when he spoke. Behind him stood 2 ranch hands, watching everything with cold curiosity. "Morrison," Thomas said with a stiff nod. Then his gaze landed on Margaret. "Miss O'Sullivan, I presume?" Margaret stood from her chair slowly. "Mr. Whitmore." "I've been waiting at my ranch since noon," he said. "Wondering what happened to my bride." The way he said "my bride" made Margaret's stomach twist. She forced herself to breathe. "There was a misunderstanding with the directions. The driver brought me here instead." Thomas looked around the cabin, then at James, then back at her. His voice dropped low. "And yet, Miss O'Sullivan, you stayed." Margaret lifted her chin. "Yes, I did." His eyes hardened. "You chose to stay." "I chose what felt right." Thomas stepped closer, anger simmering beneath the surface. "We had an agreement. You needed a home. I opened mine to you. I sent money for your travel. I prepared everything." "I'm grateful," Margaret said, "but I cannot marry you." "You don't get to change your mind," Thomas snapped. "Actually," James said from behind her, "she does." Thomas turned sharply toward him. "This has nothing to do with you, Morrison." Quote, "She belongs where she wants to be," James replied, his voice calm but steady. Thomas stepped so close that the tips of their boots nearly touched. "Stay out of this. This is between me and the woman I sent for." Margaret moved between them quickly. "Please." "This doesn't need to turn into a fight." Thomas looked down at her, jaw tight. "You don't understand what you're throwing away. I can give you security, a fine home. Respect." Thomas jerked his chin toward James. "Can't give you anything. He's barely keeping this place standing." James didn't argue. He just held Emma closer. Thomas's voice grew colder. "He's behind on his payments. One more missed one, and the bank takes everything. And that baby he's carrying isn't even his. He's playing hero, but hero stories don't pay bills." Margaret felt a sting in her chest as she looked from Thomas to James. "Is that true?" James met her eyes. "Yes." Thomas spread his hands. "You see, you're choosing poverty, hardship, a man drowning in debt. Come with me, Miss O'Sullivan. Let's leave foolishness behind." Quote, Margaret looked at James, holding the baby close, quiet and steady. She remembered how he welcomed her without question, how he fed Emma with tender hands. How he told her she was free to choose. And then she looked at Thomas, who spoke as if she were an object he'd paid for. "No," she said clearly. "I'm staying." Thomas stared at her, disbelief turning to fury. "You are making a terrible mistake." "Maybe," Margaret said softly. "But it's my mistake to make." Silence filled the room. The ranch hands shifted uneasily behind him. Thomas straightened his coat. "Very well. But don't come begging when Morrison loses this place. And when he does, I'll be first in line to collect every last thing he owes." He shot James a hard look. "Enjoy your little victory." Then he walked out. The door slammed behind him. Hoofbeats pounded away. For a long moment, the cabin stayed perfectly still. Margaret sank into her chair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've made things worse for you." "James," said Emma gently in her cradle, "you made a choice. That's not something to apologize for." Quote, "But he was right," she said quietly. "The debts, the ranch, everything." James nodded. "I stayed home to care for my sister before she died. Missed the cattle drive, missed the season's profit. Been trying to catch up ever since." Margaret's eyes softened. "Why didn't you tell me?" James gave a sad smile. "Because you didn't come here to take on my troubles." Margaret reached for his hand. "Maybe we can solve them together." James stared at her. "You've known me for 6 hours. And in those 6 hours you've shown more kindness than I've seen in years," she said. "You protected that baby. You stood up for me. You let me choose." James looked down at their joined hands, his voice low. "You really want to stay, even knowing what you're choosing?" "I want to stay," she whispered, "if you'll have me." James pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a soft, trembling touch. "Then we'll do this right. You'll have your own choices. We'll take time. No rushing. No pressure." Margaret nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Where will I stay?" Quote, James thought for a moment. "Mrs. Henderson, the widow who used to live here, she loves babies, she loves order, and she loves matchmaking more than anything. She'd be thrilled to chaperone." Margaret gave a shaky laugh. "Then let's ask her." Emma whimpered in the cradle, and Margaret lifted her gently into her arms. Emma rested her head on Margaret's shoulder, relaxed and trusting. "She likes you," James said softly. "Maybe she knows I'm not really a stranger," Margaret whispered. "Maybe she knows I'm home." James looked at her with something warm and deep in his eyes. The cabin felt peaceful again. The danger had passed, but their future was still uncertain. The debts remained. The town would talk. Thomas would watch. But Margaret wasn't afraid anymore, because for the first time in her life she had chosen something for herself. And she had chosen him. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, warm and gentle. Margaret stood beside the table, packing a small basket with biscuits and jars of jam. Today, she and James were riding into town to speak with Mrs. Henderson, the widow who once lived in this cabin and knew ranch life inside and out. Margaret's heart beat fast. Yesterday had been chaos, fear, and choices she never expected to face. Today felt like the first step toward building a life she actually wanted. James walked through the doorway holding Emma on his hip. The baby let out a happy chirp when she saw Margaret. James smiled, tired but soft. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as I can be," she said. They saddled the horses and rode toward town, with Emma bundled safely in front of James. The prairie stretched around them, golden and wide, the mountains rising in the distance like silent guards. Margaret breathed deeply. The air smelled like dust and pine and hope. When they reached the small town, people paused to stare. Whispers followed them. Margaret kept her chin high, reminding herself she wasn't ashamed of her choice. She had chosen kindness over ownership, respect over convenience. Mrs. Clara Henderson lived in a whitewashed house with a bright red door. She opened it before they even knocked. "Well, well, well," she said, hands on her hips. "I heard half the town buzzing like bees. So it's true, the bride stayed at the wrong ranch." Margaret flushed. James cleared his throat. "Mrs. Henderson, we have a favor to ask." "Oh, I know exactly what you need," Mrs. Henderson said, waving them inside. "A chaperone, a helper, a baby lover, and a woman who enjoys watching romance bloom where it's meant to." Margaret blinked. "Does everyone in this territory know our business?" "Of course they do, dear," Mrs. Henderson said with a bright smile. "Now, sit down. Tell me everything." They explained the situation. Margaret staying at Double Creek Ranch, Thomas's anger, the debts, the need for respectability while she and James figured out their future. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully. Then she clapped her hands once, sharp and certain. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll move back into that ranch today." Margaret stared. "Really?" "Absolutely," the widow said. "That cabin always felt like home to me, and that sweet baby needs more arms to hold her." James exhaled in relief. Margaret felt tears rise. Mrs. Henderson leaned in, her eyes twinkling. "Now, I don't know what your hearts are planning, but I know this. When fate sends someone to the wrong door, it usually means it was the right door all along." By sundown, Mrs. Henderson had moved back into the cabin. The place felt livelier, safer, filled with the warm voice of a woman who believed in love more than gossip. The next weeks passed in a blur of hard work. Margaret learned to mend fences, milk cows, and soothe Emma's midnight cries. She managed the accounts, stretching every penny and finding mistakes the bank had never noticed. The ranch slowly steadied under their shared effort. James worked from dawn to dusk, but every night he sat at the table with Margaret, sharing stories and smiles. Sometimes their hands touched, and neither moved away. But he kept his promise. No pressure, no expectations. One cold night, a knock came at the cabin door. Margaret froze. Memories of Thomas's anger rushed back. But when James opened the door, it wasn't him. It was the town preacher. "Evening," he said. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to stop by." Margaret glared in the widow's direction. "She did?" Mrs. Henderson smiled sweetly. "Just checking in." The preacher cleared his throat. "I hear there may be plans for a proper courtship." James looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at James. Their hearts knew the answer before their mouths did. "Yes," they both said. The preacher smiled warmly. "Well then, when the time comes, I'd be honored to marry you." 3 months later, that time came. The cabin was decorated with flowers. Townsfolk gathered in their best clothes. Emma toddled down the aisle clutching a tiny bouquet. Mrs. Henderson cried the moment the music started. Margaret stood beside James wearing the wedding dress she had carried from Boston. But this time, she wasn't a scared young woman running from debts and misery. She was a woman choosing love with both feet, planted firmly in her own future. James took her hands and whispered, "Are you nervous?" "Not anymore," Margaret said with a smile. "Not with you." The preacher spoke the vows, but Margaret barely heard the words. She was too busy looking into James's storm-colored eyes, seeing the life they had built together. Slowly, carefully, honestly. "You may kiss the bride." James pulled her close, gentle but sure. Their kiss was soft at first, then deepened with all the things they had felt since the moment she stepped onto the wrong porch. Gratitude, respect, tenderness, love. Emma clapped, the crowd cheered, and Mrs. Henderson shouted, "About time!" When they stepped outside, hand in hand, the sun dipped behind the mountains. The sky glowed gold and pink, like the world was blessing their union. "I love you," Margaret whispered. James brushed his thumb across her cheek. "I loved you from the moment you stayed." Years passed. The ranch flourished. Emma grew strong and happy. Margaret became known for her wisdom and gentle strength. James became known as a man whose greatest wealth wasn't land or cattle, but the family he built. And sometimes, on quiet nights, Margaret stood on that same porch where everything changed and whispered to herself, "The wrong address was the right destiny."